Skeletron can be really hard for players new to Expert and Master mode. Once you go into Expert mode, he gets a bunch of buffs and it becomes a big roadblock for some people. If you're someone who struggles with this fight, this video should be perfect for you. I have a bunch of experience fighting Skeletron. Over time I've developed a couple of strategies to make him easier and also allow you to defeat him before the Eater of Worlds or the Brain of Cthulhu. It's actually a really fun boss fight once you get the hang of it, and eventually you can get to the point where if you have a good enough weapon, you can just fight him the night after you kill the Eye of Cthulhu, which is super convenient. With that being said, this video will only include things you can obtain before beating your world's evil boss. So if you struggle with the items I've provided, you can always prepare yourself some post-evil boss gear and then come back to the tips later. When playing Melee, my favorite weapon to use is the Amazon, but I've also seen success with the Star Fury. In this fight you're going to want some range, and these are the only two melee options I'm aware of that can reliably kill Skeletron at this stage of the game. For the Amazon, definitely use a white string. Like I said, range is super important, and you should have room in your accessory slots to put in a white string. If you use the Star Fury, please do not even attempt to go for melee hits. The actual blade of the Star Fury has almost no reach and does shit damage as well. The stars alone will be more than enough damage to kill him before daytime. If you're playing the range class, you can pretty much use anything you'd like. The musket is perfect for those of you on Corruption Worlds, and if you didn't know, it's actually a guaranteed drop from your first Shadow Orb. It does completely absurd damage for how easy it is to get, which is why it got such an enormous nerf in 1.4.4 by removing its auto fire feature and putting it in the pause menu. The Mini Shark is great if you find yourself with lots of money available. It's not too often you have 35 gold this early in the game, but if you do, the Mini Shark is a totally viable option. The Boomstick is also an incredible choice. If you spend any time looting in the jungle, it won't be hard to acquire one, and it's totally worth it. It's one of the best weapons in the entirety of pre-hard mode, and will be perfect for fighting Skeletron. Even with bad modifiers, these weapons will work great, and in general, range stuff in the best class for the entirety of the game. At least until you get to those lousy stealth set bonuses. If you choose to use magic weapons, you only really have one option, being any of the high tier gem staffs. The gem staffs are pretty average on their own, however there are so many different armor sets and buffs mages have available to them in pre-hard mode that will make the gem staffs a great choice for fighting Skeletron. I would highly recommend farming for gems using gem corns, as you're going to want a good hook and a robe as well. Not a lot to say here, just get your gems and do your thing. If you're playing Summoner, you actually only have one choice, and that's to use a snap thrower with either a Finch or a Flink staff. The snap thrower has great base damage and range, and you're going to need it in order to do enough damage to Skeletron before daytime. It's honestly a really powerful weapon, so even though it's your only choice, it's a pretty solid one at that. The snap thrower's only problem is that it can be very challenging to acquire if you're purely using summoner weapons. The Finch and Flink staff, despite being the worst summons in the game, can actually put out some nice damage with the extra 6 tag damage provided by the Snap Thorn. The Flink staff may be a little bit better against Skeletron, but it's a lot of work just for a slight buff over the Finch staff. Either one will work fine. For armor, you should mainly focus on maximizing defense. Personally, I like to go for the jungle hat and pants no matter what class I'm playing. They have great defense values and they're super easy to craft. Considering you'll likely find yourself in the jungle anyways for the different weapons and accessories, I would highly recommend just getting the resources necessary for the hat and pants while you're there. The reason I don't usually get the chest plate as well is because it requires so many stingers that I don't really think it's worth it. Obviously the jungle armor is even better if you're playing as a mage, and I'll almost certainly go for it if that's the case. However, I would still recommend a gem robe over the jungle chest plate. The other big class-based set is the fossil armor. I don't really think you need this at all, as ranged already has incredible damage output without it, but if you really struggle with the fight, it is an option. Ninja armor can be nice, but I wouldn't go for the whole set. It really doesn't have that much defense, and the movement speed you get from the set bonus is pretty much useless. It's more so just one of those things you throw on if you have nothing better than it. Any of the higher tier ore armors are great for defense, especially gold and platinum, but once again, it's more so just something you throw on if you have nothing else. Lastly, the Flinks fur coat is an awesome option for summoners, but it completely sucks to grind for. Anything with good defense should be your main priority, but some things like gem robes and Flinks fur coat provide such good overall bonuses that their low defense values really don't matter at all. It should be pretty obvious, but there is no reason to not be using both Hermes boots and the Shield of Cthulhu. The Hermes boots literally double your speed, and if you spend enough time looting underground, you're almost guaranteed to find a pair. The Shield of Cthulhu is dropped by the Eye of Cthulhu, and in my opinion is the best accessory in the game. The ability to instantly switch directions while retaining full momentum is so amazing, it's pretty much impossible to replace in Expert and Master mode. It's also super helpful for dodging the flying skulls from Skeletron, which I'll show in the tips section. You're also going to need some vertical mobility. If you manage to get the Goblin Tinker, the best option is Spectre Boots. You can also go for one of the balloon variations, or you can stick with the bottle variation, even if it's just a cloud in a bottle. You're going to want at least one. The Shark Tooth Necklace is very beneficial against Skeletron as he's got a lot of defense. It's seen as a pretty rare item, but in reality I'm usually able to get one every time a Blood Moon occurs. Feral Claws work well with the Snapthorn. It's not too tricky to find them in the jungle, and it's literally just extra whip damage. One thing to note though is that if you choose to use the Star Fury, they actually do not increase the rate at which you shoot the stars, only how fast the sword swings. So basically it does nothing. After all this, you're likely going to have a couple open accessory slots, to which I would recommend using anything with a good modifier, prioritizing defense. The White String is perfect for this. It costs 30 webs and you can continue crafting it over and over until you get a good modifier. This is a great option for all classes. It doesn't need to be an accessory that benefits you at all. If it has a good modifier, it's worth using. It's usually pretty easy to get 400 health. You only need 15 life crystals, and assuming you've been exploring a lot underground in the jungle, you probably have a couple left over. If for whatever reason you can't get to 400 health, the lowest I would go for is 300. For buffs, you're almost always going to want Iron Skin, Regeneration, and some sort of well-fed buff. These are all very easy to get and helpful for all classes. There's so many other potions that are a bit more situational, some of the more notable ones being the Archery, Magic Power, Mana Regeneration, and Summoning Potions. The Archery potion is good if you're using a bow, the Magic Power potion is good if you're playing mage, and the Summoning potion is highly recommended for summoners, even if it can be a little difficult to get at times. The Mana Regeneration potion, however, is in my opinion a must-have for all mages. A lot of people like using the Mana Flower instead. However, the Mana Flower not only takes up an extra accessory slot, but it also constantly applies the Mana Sickness debuff, which can heavily reduce your damage output. In 1.4.4, there are also new Shimmer buffs. The main two that actually matter in pre-hard mode are the Vital Crystal and the Arcane Crystal, which can be obtained by throwing a Life Crystal and a Mana Crystal into Shimmer. If you aren't aware, Shimmer is a new liquid found in the Aether mini biome, located between the jungle and the ocean underground. It can do a whole lot of different things, but I'm not going to run through all that here, so if you'd like to learn more about it, I'd recommend checking out a video on YouTube or looking at its wiki page. Anyways, the Vital Crystal grants a permanent buff to health regeneration, while the Arcane Crystal grants a permanent buff to mana regeneration. You can only use each of these once per character. Lastly, there are a few station buffs in the game, though the only one that you can obtain before beating Skeletron is the Sharpening Station. Luckily, the Sharpening Station happens to be the best one. It can be found in underground jungle cabins and gives 12 armor penetration to any melee weapon, which is incredible against Skeletron. This turns the Amazon from a decent weapon to a very powerful weapon, so this is definitely something worth looking for if you're playing melee. There are other buffs you can go for, however they usually aren't necessary and a lot of them can be pretty annoying to get. The arena is very simple. It mainly revolves around two large platforms over top of the dungeon. These should be fairly spread apart. A good rule of thumb could be the length of your hook when standing still. Obviously, the longer the platforms the better, but you can make them whatever length you feel necessary. The most important thing is to keep a good distance between the platforms so you can easily dodge downwards without constantly breaking your momentum. Alongside the main two platforms, I'd also recommend running some down the side of the dungeon. Doing this not only allows for more space to dodge, but it'll also help prevent some really annoying deaths by fall damage. I also like to add rows of vertical platforms on the edges of the arena to make it easier to grapple back to the arena in case you're chased off of it. These come into play a lot more than you'd initially think. Finally, just like in any other arena, you're going to want some buffs. Campfires are a no-brainer, and most of you will probably have a spare life crystal to craft a heart lantern. Other things like honey or bass statues can help out as well. Although this would be the ideal arena for Skeletron, sometimes you end up with a seed that's just straight ass cheeks. The dungeon may be high off the ground, the dungeon may be right next to a corruption biome, the shit may be floating 100 blocks in the air. Usually adding a few extra platforms below the main arena, or walling off a corruption or crimson biome will do the trick. Finally, the tips. I really want to stress that these tips will apply no matter what gear you choose to use, however I'd highly recommend equipping at least some kind of hook. Even if you have barely used hooks up to this point, not only do they increase your movement capabilities immensely, but they also provide some niche use cases that I'll detail shortly. With that out of the way, remember to bring over all your buffs and you should be good to go. Before you summon him, remember to actually use all of your buffs and make sure your arena is lit up with torches. This fight can be fairly long in comparison to others, so do your best to summon him early in the night. As soon as you summon him, immediately dash towards your arena. You're almost always going to get hit here, either as soon as he spawns in or on the transition into the arena. Don't bother wasting a health potion if you do happen to get hit. With all the different regen buffs you have, it's not going to take long to fully recover. This is definitely something you should be thinking about in any boss fight. Skeletron's first phase is by far the hardest in the fight. Unless this is your first time in expert mode, you're probably aware that you want to aim to kill both hands at about the same time. The problem with killing one too early is that after one hand is down, Skeletron will begin to shoot flying skulls. This alongside his other hand continuing to attack you can be a nightmare to deal with. Now you may be wondering, why can't you just kill the skull before the two hands? Next, avoid getting hit by Skeletron's spin attack at all costs. The knockback from getting hit once allows Skeletron to constantly chain together high damage hits, which will either lead to you taking hundreds of damage or just flat out dying instantly. The absolute worst way to go about getting hit by this attack is to panic and spam your dash like an idiot. Dashing will only bump you further back into the skull due to how the Shield Cthulhu behaves when striking an enemy, and this will 100% lead to you dying. The way I find works best is just stay calm and look for something to hook onto. Even with perfect execution, you'll still probably end up having to take at least 200 damage, but hey, you're alive. With all this trouble, however, your best bet would be to avoid getting hit by the spinning skull altogether. After a few fights, you'll start to get the timing down as to when you think he's going to enter his spin attack, and from there on it's as simple as just anticipating it and getting out of the way. If you're having trouble keeping track of when he's going to spin, try counting to 13 as soon as he begins attacking normally. Moving on, Skeletron very clearly communicates when he's going to swing away with his hands at you. You'll notice that whenever one of Skeletron's hands is about to attack you, it will slowly move in a straight direction before flinging back at the player. This motion can be super obvious or it may be very subtle. The best indicator from my own experience is to watch for a sudden drop in speed of the hand. Just like for the spin attack, from here on it's as simple as just anticipating and getting out of the way of his hands. The only difference being that he attacks with his hands a lot more frequently. Last thing I'd like to mention for phase 1 is that Skeletron is very easy to bait. By running away from him for as long as you can and then suddenly turning around with a hook or a dash, you can give yourself some breathing room to make dodging much easier. This is something that can be applied to literally every single boss in the game. However, I believe that Skeletron is one of the best examples of it. In fact, Skeletron might be the best example of pretty much everything important to dodging. He's predictable, he's actually difficult, and he's one of the first fights where using your dash and a hook gives you a noticeable advantage. This on top of him being completely free to summon means that if you struggle to effectively use the Shield of Cthulhu or a hook when dodging, Skeletron is the perfect boss to practice on. Once you manage to kill both hands, you've pretty much won already. Despite being a floating head, Skeletron Phase 2 can be really intimidating to some players due to the flying skulls he shoots. Lucky for you, with a little bit of practice and proper technique, it'll be as if the flying skulls aren't even there. Basically, the idea is to time dashes in between the skulls. Usually I'll try to dash every other skull, however sometimes you'll see me wait for 2 skulls before I dash, whatever the situation calls for. After a few dashes, be prepared for him to do a spin attack, run away for a few seconds and continue as usual. Try to get out of the way a little before he exits his spin attack, as otherwise his first skull will catch you off guard. Whenever Skeletron is not spinning, he'll always try to float above the player, both in Phase 1 and Phase 2. This is the reason why dashing between his skulls works in the first place, and it's also the foundation for being able to bait him in Phase 1. Use this to your advantage to steer him around your character once he exits his spin attack. This can usually be achieved by running away from him or sometimes just standing still. And that's about it for Phase 2. As long as you have enough time left in the night, you pretty much just win. Definitely don't feel bad if his Phase 2 is giving you trouble. It takes a few fights to get the hang of it, but if for whatever reason you just cannot get the timing down to dash between the skulls, you can always go back to our good friend, the circle strat. Thank you all so much for watching. I know this is echoed across every outro on YouTube, but seriously, it means a lot. I really hope I was able to help some of you defeat Skeletron, and if you manage to do it before your world's evil boss, enjoy flying through pre-hardmode with the best weapons you can possibly get before killing the wall of flesh. Any criticism would be super helpful. I'll be reading any and every comment this video gets, and I'd love to hear about what parts you guys liked or didn't like. Also, if you guys have any video ideas you'd like me to cover, leave that in the comments as well. That's about all I have to say. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.